What if Joe McNamara's disappearance was never the real attack, but only the first move in a much bigger plan? By the time Lioness Season 3, Episode 6 begins, Joe is no longer simply missing. She has been taken off the board at the exact moment her operation was getting dangerously close to exposing the person hiding behind the entire network. And that raises a terrifying question. How did the enemy know exactly when to strike? Was Joe betrayed from inside her own operation? Or has someone been watching her team from the beginning, waiting for the perfect moment to turn everything they had learned against them? Episode 5 left us with a situation that looked like a rescue mission, but the deeper you look at what happened, the more it starts to feel like something much darker. Joe's team believed Operation Treasure was finally working. They had begun flipping assets, tracing handlers, and moving through the layers of what became known as the Idiot Army. Every answer seemed to bring them one step closer to the center of the operation, yet every time they reached another name, another handler, or another compromised asset, they discovered the same disturbing pattern. Nobody seemed to know who was actually giving the orders. And that is exactly what makes Episode 6 so dangerous. Because if the people Joe's team captured or flipped were never supposed to know the identity of the person above them, then the entire network was designed around one purpose: protecting the person at the very top. Joe may have spent weeks believing she was hunting an enemy network, but she may actually have been walking directly into a trap created specifically for someone like her. And now that she is gone, her team has to figure out whether they are trying to save Joe, or whether saving Joe is only going to lead them deeper into the enemy's plan. The biggest problem is that they are already running out of time. The aircraft carrying Joe has disappeared from normal tracking, leaving American officials with almost no clean way to determine where she is being taken. Kyle and the rest of the team can search for the aircraft, but finding a plane flying dark is one thing. Stopping it without triggering an international crisis is something completely different. And while the tactical team focuses on the physical location of Joe, Caitlin and Westfield are dealing with an entirely different battlefield. They have to convince Washington that this is not just another covert operation gone wrong. Joe's disappearance could have consequences far beyond one missing operative, because whatever she uncovered appears to be connected to a network powerful enough to move people, information, and resources across borders without exposing the person controlling it. That is why the first moments of Episode 6 carry so much weight. Everyone is looking for Joe, but someone else may already be looking for them. Think about the timing. Operation Treasure starts producing meaningful results, Joe's team begins moving closer to the upper levels of the network, and suddenly, Joe disappears. That timing is almost impossible to ignore. If the enemy had simply reacted to Joe's investigation, there should have been confusion, mistakes, and panic. Instead, everything surrounding her disappearance feels prepared. A plane is available. A route is established. The operation moves quickly. And that suggests that whoever ordered Joe's removal did not suddenly discover the threat. They were waiting for it. This is where the idea of the Idiot Army becomes much more important than it first appeared. The people inside this network may believe they understand the mission, but they are actually disposable pieces positioned between the real architect and anyone trying to expose them. If one person gets captured, another person takes their place. If one handler is exposed, another layer remains hidden. If an asset is flipped, the information they provide may already be something the enemy expected them to reveal. In other words, Joe's greatest success could potentially have been part of the enemy's greatest defense. And that possibility completely changes the meaning of Operation Treasure. Joe created the operation because she understood how to turn the enemy's own structure against itself. She knew that if an asset could be flipped, the handler could be exposed, and if the handler could be exposed, the team could move higher up the chain. But what happens when the person at the top understands that exact strategy? What happens when the enemy knows Joe's methods well enough to build an entire defense around them? That is the question Episode 6 now has to answer. Because Joe is not just fighting people who want her dead. She may be fighting someone who understands exactly how she thinks. And if that is true, then every clue her team follows could be leading them somewhere the enemy wants them to go. Meanwhile, Caitlin is facing the uncomfortable reality that there may be no perfect outcome. Bringing Joe home could mean violating diplomatic boundaries. Waiting could mean losing Joe permanently. And acting too aggressively could expose an operation that was never supposed to exist publicly in the first place. That leaves the team with an impossible choice. Follow the rules and risk being too late, or break the rules and potentially create an international crisis. But there is another question that may be even more important than where Joe is being taken. Who knew enough about Operation Treasure to make this move possible? Because if the enemy knew Joe was getting close, somebody had to know what she was doing. Somebody had access to information that should have been protected. And that brings us to the most disturbing possibility heading into episode 6. The threat may not be standing somewhere far away. It may already be inside the system Joe trusted. Every person with access to her operation suddenly becomes more interesting. Every conversation, every briefing, every movement of information has to be reconsidered. Because the greatest weakness of an intelligence operation is not always the technology or the weapons. Sometimes it is trust. And Joe's entire strategy depended on understanding who could be trusted and who could not. Now her own team has to ask themselves whether they made the same mistake they were exploiting in their enemies. If someone inside their world has been feeding information to the architect, then Joe's disappearance was not a random failure. It was the inevitable result of a leak that may have existed long before anyone realized it. And if episode 6 confirms even part of that theory, then the story is about to become much bigger than simply finding Joe. It becomes a question of whether the people searching for her can trust the information they are receiving. Because what if the person helping them find Joe is actually helping the enemy control where they look? What if every step toward the truth has been anticipated? And what if Joe herself already understood this before she disappeared? That possibility makes her absence even more frightening. Joe is one of the few people capable of recognizing the pattern because she built Operation Treasure herself. She understands layered networks. She understands cutouts. She understands how an organization can hide its leader behind people who never even realize they are protecting them. So, if Joe is alive and has realized what is happening, she may be doing everything she can to survive long enough to leave behind one final clue. But if she has been taken by someone who knows her methods just as well as she knows theirs, then the clock is already running. And as episode 6 moves forward, the question will no longer be whether Joe's team can find the enemy. The question will be whether the enemy wants them to find it, because sometimes the most dangerous trap is not the one you fail to see. It is the one you believe you have successfully escaped. The search for Joe now becomes more desperate, because the longer her team goes without a confirmed location, the more obvious it becomes that this was not a simple extraction. Somewhere beyond their reach, Joe is being moved by people who planned this operation before anyone in Washington even realized there was a problem. And while the tactical team tries to reconstruct the aircraft's route, Caitlin and Westfield are forced to work through the diplomatic maze surrounding the disappearance. They cannot simply send American forces wherever they want, because the moment they cross into another country's airspace or territory, the mission changes completely. What was once a covert intelligence operation could suddenly become an international confrontation. But for Caitlin, those complications are becoming less important by the minute. She knows Joe, and she knows that Joe would never disappear quietly without a fight. If Joe has been taken alive, there is a reason. Whoever has her wants something, and that something is almost certainly connected to what she discovered through Operation Treasure. The deeper the team digs into the network, the more disturbing the structure becomes. The so-called idiot army is not really one organization operating under one visible command. It is a collection of people connected through layers of handlers, assets, intermediaries, and cutouts. Each person knows just enough to perform their role, but not enough to expose the person above them. That structure is what makes the enemy so difficult to destroy. Take away one piece, and the rest of the machine continues moving. Capture one operative, and another can replace them. Expose one handler, and the trail simply disappears behind another wall. But there is something else happening now. The team is beginning to realize that these layers are not only protecting the architect, they are also controlling the information that Joe's team receives. That means the investigation itself could be compromised. Every name they uncover might be real, but that does not mean the information is useful. The enemy can allow certain pieces to be discovered while keeping the most important piece completely invisible. And this is where Joe's own strategy begins to turn against her team. Operation Treasure was designed to make the enemy's people betray their handlers. But if the handlers themselves were already disposable, then flipping them may only reveal exactly what the architect wants Joe to see. The question becomes almost impossible to answer. How do you hunt someone who has deliberately built an organization where nobody knows who they are? The answer may be hidden in the timing of Joe's disappearance. She was removed only after the operation began generating serious results. That suggests the enemy was monitoring the investigation closely enough to recognize the moment Joe became dangerous. Someone knew she was getting close. Someone knew which assets had been flipped. Someone knew that the next step could eventually expose the center of the network. And once that realization became unavoidable, the decision was made to remove Joe before she could reach it. That means the aircraft carrying Joe may be more than a method of transportation. It could be the physical evidence that proves just how far the enemy's reach extends. If the team can identify who arranged the flight, who supplied the aircraft, and who cleared its movement, they may finally have a thread leading toward the people behind the operation. But that thread is extremely dangerous, because following it could expose the exact people who helped Joe disappear, and those people may already be prepared for the investigation. Meanwhile, the pressure on Caitlin continues to rise. She has to balance the official response with the reality that every minute matters. Washington wants facts before making a move. Caitlin wants action before the facts become irrelevant. Those two priorities are fundamentally opposed. If she moves too quickly, she could create a diplomatic disaster. If she waits for approval, Joe could be gone forever. And the people responsible for Joe's disappearance understand that perfectly. They are not simply fighting the United States with weapons. They are using hesitation, jurisdiction, bureaucracy, and uncertainty as weapons of their own. That is what makes this situation so dangerous. The enemy does not need to defeat Joe's team directly if it can force the team to defeat itself through restrictions and conflicting orders. But Joe's people are not willing to stand still. Kyle and the tactical team continue searching for the aircraft, trying to reconstruct its movements from whatever information they can obtain. Every detail matters now. A tail number, a flight path, a communication, a fuel stop, a piece of intelligence that looked meaningless before. Any one of those could reveal where Joe was taken. Yet the longer they investigate, the more they encounter the same problem. There is no obvious destination. The plane is essentially a ghost. It exists, it moves, and someone controls it. But officially, it barely exists at all. And that is exactly the kind of operation the Lioness world is built around. Nothing is clean, nothing is simple. Every solution creates another problem. Every victory comes with a cost. While the tactical side searches for Joe, the political side begins to understand that this situation may be much larger than one missing operative. The network Joe uncovered could have connections that reach into diplomatic channels, intelligence circles, and foreign governments. If that is true, then simply identifying the enemy will not be enough. The team will have to determine which institutions have been compromised and which people are unknowingly helping the network survive. This also brings the focus back to the people who have been around Joe throughout the season. The audience has been trained to look outward, toward foreign governments and covert networks, but the real danger may be much closer. If the architect needed information about Operation Treasure, there were only a limited number of people who could have provided it. That does not automatically make any particular character guilty, but it changes the way every interaction should be viewed. A normal briefing can suddenly become suspicious. A routine phone call can become important. A harmless conversation can contain information that should never have left the room. The show has spent the season teaching us that proximity does not necessarily mean loyalty. In fact, proximity can be the greatest advantage a traitor has. Someone who looks trustworthy does not need to break into the operation. They are already inside it. And that possibility becomes even more disturbing when you consider how quickly the enemy responded to Joe's progress. This was not the reaction of someone who had just discovered a threat. It was the reaction of someone who had been monitoring the situation. That suggests the architect may have had advance warning that Operation Treasure was working. Perhaps they knew which assets had turned. Perhaps they knew which handler Joe's team was targeting next. Or perhaps they simply understood Joe well enough to predict what she would do. Whatever the explanation, the result is the same. Joe